Hello and welcome to the Pondering Papaya podcast. My name's Sam Cooper and today I've got a very special episode for you. I'm going to be speaking to a man who went from working in the Royal Navy to working at McLaren's F1 team. His name is Josh Rolls and he was at McLaren from 2015 to 2018, meaning he's got plenty of stories to tell us, plenty of information about what it was like back then, and also what a certain Fernando Alonso was like. So stay tuned to find out just what it's like to work for McLaren. So joining me now is Josh. First of all, Josh, thanks hugely for coming on the podcast. So how are you doing today?
Hey Sam, yeah, thanks for having me. Firstly, yeah, all good, thank you. How about yourself?
Yeah, all good. Yeah, not too bad. As we talk, Silverstone's just been renewed for 10 years. So that's good news for us based in the UK at least. You're a guy with an incredibly interesting background. I mean, it's not often we get to speak to people who've worked in Formula One teams and worked in jobs like yours. So before we get to McLaren and sort of how you got into F1, if we can go back to the very start, because I'd imagine there's a lot of people listening who they've always wanted to get into F1. They want to know what the pathway is. And I mean, it's something I get asked a lot about journalism, how to get into it. And I'm always like, there's no set path. And I think you can sort of speak to that, how you sort of got into F1 and whether it was something you always wanted to do or sort of just the opportunity came up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think as, growing up, I loved motorsport, loved Formula One. I've got fond memories of sitting, on Sundays watching the race with my dad and things like that. So, but it's always one of those things that you see on TV and you never think, I want to be there. As a young boy, I never thought, oh, I want to be in Formula One. So I guess my route to Formula One happened quite naturally and unexpectedly. To be honest, I obviously school and things like that. Did okay at school. Didn't have any ambition to go and do university degrees or anything like that because university wasn't for me. I'm an engineer. I like physical. I like doings. I like using my hands and taking things apart. That's quite known for that as a child, taking toys apart and putting them back together and things like that. So when I left school, I actually joined the military. I joined the Royal Navy as a helicopter engineer. So that was kind of my uncle served in the military, and it was always something I wanted to do. Never wanted to make a full, 22-year career out of it. But I thought for a young 17-year-old lad, the military was a great experience. It offers a lot, and I thought, well, within the military, there's lots of different things you can do. Engineering was a huge interest of mine, so particularly aerospace actually. So that's what I did. I joined the military. I went off to basic training. And then I went on to Aeronautical Engineering School in Portsmouth and was based out of Yeovil, working on the Sea King Mark IVs, which was a commando helicopter serving the Royal Marines effectively a large green taxi for the Royal Marines. But it was great, and in the Navy, that's kind of where I really learned the more procedural side. I've always been, like I say, mechanically minded, and as a kid, always done projects of building things and mending things and stuff like that. But in the military, I guess it become a lot more professional. And these are aircraft that fly in the sky, right? The parts have many different scrutinies behind them. They have lifing. You have to life every component. Every component gets recorded against how many hours it's flying, service intervals, etc., etc. And what I didn't realize at the time was actually how similar that was to Formula One, because I had never experienced Formula One. I've never even been to a Formula One factory before in my life. Mm-hmm. But as I moved through my career into Formula One, there was a lot of overlaps. And actually, looking back on it now, the military set me up very, very well for what I was about to face, not only just at McLaren Formula One, but at McLaren GT, where I moved next. So I had a really good opportunity. I was 5 years into my Navy career, was enjoying it, was not actively, not actively planning to leave. I think always looking to the next opportunity, where's my life going to take me next? And I remember quite vividly, actually, the moment I was scrolling through, I think it was LinkedIn at the time, mm-hmm. and I saw a job advert appear for a engine builder at McLaren GT. They build V8 twin turbo 3.8 litre engines for their McLaren race cars. And I kind of looked at it and I thought, yeah, in my dreams kind of thing, and shut my laptop and that was it, and off to bed. But I remember that night waking up at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and the first thing that was on my mind was that job. And I kind of thought, well, I guess someone has to apply for it, right? Like, I'm sure lots of people apply for it, but what says that I haven't got the skill set to do it? So I thought, what have I got to lose? Nothing, right? Just a bit of time pulling a CV together and whatnot. So I did it and submitted it. And actually, it was that same, that was early hours of the morning. That same day, I had an email from the HR team at McLaren, and they said, love your CV. The engine build manager would love to have an interview with you. Would you be happy to? And I was kind of like, whoa, this got real quick. So it kind of went from like this, oh, that will never happen, to, oh yeah, here's an interview. And well, I mean, I went to their facility, which was in Woking. It was based just down the road from MTC at the time. And it was like a kid's playground. It was like, as a kid, walking into a sweet shop and being like, wow, this is incredible. I remember walking in, they had lines of P1s, because they were currently doing the P1 development. McLaren GT used to do a lot of development work for McLaren as well. And there was race cars, there was GT3 cars, there was GT4 cars, there was road cars. And for me, coming from living in Devon, where opportunities are, they're okay, but there's actually not anything like that around here, to go into Surrey and seeing this, this incredible thing, really opened my eyes. So I did the job interview and whatnot. And whilst I was driving home back to work, actually, Tim White, who is a legend in the kind of engine build world, called me and said, oh, we'd love to offer you the job. And I was like, wow, this was all happened so fast. It was only that morning I submitted my CV. And I think, looking back on it, I think coming from a military background where you have the discipline, the integrity, the hard work ethic, etc., I think probably suited the engine build role quite well. It's a very technical job, right? I mean, building an engine is not for the faint-hearted, let's say the least. The problem with that is that I had this job offer, which was something that I never thought I'd have, but I wanted it. I wanted to do it. And on the other hand, I had the military, which actually, the notice period for serving in the military is a whole year.
Wow, okay.
So I had this dilemma where I thought, well, I want to take this job. How am I going to get someone to sign off me leaving the military in this 2-month period that McLaren want me? That was tough. It was tough. I had to have conversations with, very high up in the military, etc. But obviously I got there because I went on to work at McLaren GT. But what I think is quite good about serving in the military, that the reason they have that year's notice period is because I think a lot of people get fed up with the military, and people will just hand their notice in and will just go on to do something. It doesn't matter, they don't have anything particularly lined up. Whereas actually, I think if you have a career lined up after the military, I think they're a little bit more forgiving. So I was very fortunate. They allowed me to go, and they allowed me to start this job that I guess was never really a dream, because I never thought that was possible. That's how I started at McLaren GT. It was quite the journey, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's fascinating. Like, it's such a good story. When you got there, what was it like? Was it like a duck out of water, or did you think there was quite a lot of similarities between that and your time in the military?
Yeah, I mean, it was very different in terms of day to day. Obviously, the technical side was something, I'd never fully built an engine from the ground up. So there was a lot of learning, and they were great. They'd done a big learning package, shadowing other engine builders. There was only actually three of us there, engine builders. So it's a very small, close-knit team. But the kind of day-to-day running of, I guess, working a normal job, because that's what it is, right? It's a normal job compared to the military, was very different, because, the military, you're told where to be, what time, what to wear. And it was just that transition period. And a lot of people do struggle with it. I found it fine. It was actually quite refreshing to be able to go and have a bit more kind of responsibility and a bit more ownership around your life and what you do. The transition was, I would just say it was different. It was very different to what I had only known was the military.
So you're at McLaren GTF, is that right? For just over a year? I had it as May till October the following year. Is that right?
Yeah, it was about 2 years. I don't think my LinkedIn's quite right. It was about 2 years at GT, and that was started off as an engine build role. So I stayed an engine builder through my time at McLaren GT, and part of that kind of small team GT racing is that you actually have a lot of different roles. So I ended up being a race mechanic. So during the Monday to Friday at the factory, we would build the engines, we would supply them out to the workshop, and the workshop would fit them into the cars. And then for the weekends and things, we were traveling all around Europe, racing GT cars. And I made up part of the mechanics team. So I was number 2 mechanic, and also part of the pit stop crew. So in GT racing, I was the wheel carrier.
Oh wow! Okay.
So it was a bit of a hectic. It went from this kind of 9 to 5 job to this kind of hectic whole week lifestyle, I guess, as you will. But I loved it. It was great fun. And GT racing is really good fun, really interesting, really good fun.
Yeah, I mean, just touching that. I mean, it's interesting to say race mechanic because I think that's one of the terms that we hear a lot in F1, and perhaps people don't actually know what that is. I mean, in our heads, it's just the person that talks to the driver, but maybe you could explain a bit about what it takes, what you're sort of doing during a race, like what that role is really.
Yeah, so you have so race mechanic is the physical mechanic who builds the cars. Any issues with the car, they will diagnose it. Any component change, you can change the components, you'd set the car up, all in line with the performance engineer. Who the performance engineer is the engineer who talks to the driver. He's the person who has, I would say, the closest relationship with the driver, right? Because all the feedback comes from him. So that's pretty much how it works. Driver feeds back to the race engineer. Engineer will feed back to the mechanical team. But when the car's on track, you are listening in on the headset. You're listening in to potential issues, potential setup changes that are coming in, just kind of prepping and just always forward thinking of what the race engine, the performance engineer is actually going to say to you. Because he might turn around and say, right, we're going to do a complete setup change, or we're just going to change the rear wing or the front wing or whatever it might be. So you are having to use your initiative quite a lot and always forward think and forward plan for anything.
So yeah, you spent a couple of years at McLaren GT, and then obviously you move on to McLaren Racing. So again, how did that opportunity come up? Was that similar to where you just saw a job advert and you sort of went for it and you got it, or was it something you'd always wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, I was very happy at McLaren GT. It was I never thought my next progression would be to Formula One until I went to MTC for the first time, and that was where I was like, wow, I thought McLaren GT was something special. This is up there, this is Formula One. This is where it happens. And from there, I guess I got in my mind, it was just, that's where I want to go. That's where I want to go. And I'm so close now because I'm within McLaren. Surely that's possible. And exactly that, it was very much possible because it was kind of internal. It made the transition quite easy. I remember going for what's called a car build role, which is basically the behind the scenes of Formula One car build. So that is a role that consists of things like pre-season brand new car build, all the prototyping, and then throughout the season, it's all when the gearboxes come back or the cars come back, it's all the servicing, component servicing, rebuilding of the cars, obviously into their sections, engine, gearbox, and chassis, and then supporting the race team wherever it's needed, such as testing and things. So I went for the interview, and the interview was a physical interview. So it was an engineering drawing, it was a pedal box, bearings, washers, thrust washers, torque settings, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I did the practical and did a verbal interview and things like that. And yeah, I got the role at McLaren, which was again quite eye-opening, but I guess at that point I had my eyes set on it, and it was that's where I wanted to go. I wanted to be in this pinnacle of motorsport. I wanted to be at the pinnacle of my game as a mechanical engineer. So I got the role. It was great. Started at McLaren MTC, and driving into that place every day had to pinch yourself.
Yeah, I was going to say, what's it like working at the MT6? I'm lucky. I've been there a few times. Obviously, does it ever lose its appeal coming there every day, walking down the boulevard?
No, never. No. And it's pretty cool because the race bays where the Formula One cars are built are kind of just below the boulevard. I'm sure you know, Sam, but you kind of look down into it. So actually, when you're building cars and it's your day to day, and you just doing what you do, you look up and there's always people just looking in on you. It's almost like a fishbowl, it's surreal.
I bet. So, it's a good time to talk to you, really, because obviously we're sort of heading into pre-season now. Just using your sort of knowledge, like how far along are the cars at this stage? Are they pretty much ready to go, or would you say they still a bit more building to go? Like, how last minute were you leaving it until you had that first pre-season test?
Well, it depends. I mean, there's so many factors that stack up as to where the cars are right now. I mean, it's been known that sometimes cars for the launch, for the the livery launch, aren't the cars that end up racing. And there's a few reasons for that. A few reasons being that technically they're just a bit further behind in the manufacturing and the build, or actually the fact that they don't want to release the proper car because that's innovation being revealed, right? So there is a fine balance between keeping it, very secret and whatnot. But typically now you would, pre-season testing is just around the corner. Most cars will be, you see on Instagram and social media that all the fire ups are being done. Cars are doing shakedowns and things like that. But from a simple shakedown, there can be a lot of work. If you do, it's the first time you run the car in anger, you run it at its maximum temperatures, you run it on, high downforce, you start to see things going wrong. You start to see carbon fiber cracking, you start to see bodywork overheating. All sorts of issues can arise if the pre-work hasn't been done right. But I think most of the time now, certainly when they're developing iterations of cars, which is where they are now, the rule change happened a few years back, and now they're just iteratively changing cars. So it's not so bad, but when you've got a fresh design, a fresh build, a new, different engine that's going into it, like we had at McLaren when we went from Honda to Renault, it was a big change, big change.
And when we talk about these shakedowns and stuff, like what sort of stuff are they searching for? Of course, obviously you do so much work in the sim and you do so much work in the wind tunnels. Like, how much would you say is still not known before you actually get to the track, or is it pretty much we know exactly what's going to happen? We just want to see it actually happen.
Yeah, no, I think there is always a lot of unknowns because you can't. I think it doesn't matter how much CFD you do or how much wind tunnel time you do, you cannot replicate a car on a track going over, the slightest bumps in the road, the slightest uneven surface, or whatever it might be. So there are always issues that crop up in pre-season testing, and pre-season testing is always long days. It's always fault finding, rectification. But if you do pre-season or shakedowns and pre-season testing and you rectify those issues, you do really set yourself up for a much better year. But if you start the season on the back foot, it's tough work on, the fans, because the fans want to see the cars go well, but also on the team, because, not only does it start to hit your kind of, your morale and things like that, it's, it can really start to get on top of you. So pre-season testing and shakedowns are really important.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned about like the morale stuff. Obviously, like that sort of period for McLaren was quite a tricky one, obviously, because you mentioned the Honda engines and stuff like that. I mean, first of all, we can sort of start with, I don't know if he was there by the time he came, but obviously Zach Brown came in as sort of like a huge change to McLaren, like probably the biggest change since Bruce McLaren used to run it. But like, how was that for you? Like, how did you notice like an environment change? How was he to work under, really?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I started at McLaren kind of in the very, very late Ron era, and it was in that transition. And it went from, I had only heard stories about the whole how Ron used to keep his, his tight ship and all things like that. I think the atmosphere at McLaren relaxed a little bit, but I would say actually because it was a bit more relaxed, I think people went a bit further. People did a bit more. People took that little extra bit more pride in it. But Zach is a businessman and Ron was a racer. There's a big difference between the two and how maybe they would run McLaren. But when I first started, in the Honda kind of era, it was tough, very tough, because we had bad car, right? Very bad car. We had one of the best drivers on the grid, Fernando, driving this car, and the two just didn't align. Zach come in, we didn't have many sponsors on the car in 2017? 2017, yeah, must have been 2017, 2018. But what Zach has done in terms of building the McLaren brand back up and bringing sponsors on board, I think he's done a phenomenal job. But I think also he has brought in a very good technical team and promoted people within McLaren to, rightly so, where they should be within McLaren, because there's some very, very technical and capable people there who maybe just didn't have the opportunity back in the wrong days.
I mean, it's interesting, your background, it's probably perfectly placed really, because obviously you spent so long building engines and then suddenly you were in a different role where you weren't building the engines anymore. Like, what was that? Was that just frustrating? Because obviously there was a lot of rumoured talk about the engine being the issue kind of stuff, and you've come from a background where you're building them and they're working well. Like, how did you find that?
Yeah, I mean, F1 technology is, a lot of people look at an F1 car, and rightly so if you're not maybe as technically minded, but you look at an F1 car and you go, wow, there is a lot going on here. At the end of the day, it's nuts and bolts, right? Everything works the same. It's just the innovation within that component. So the innovation between a GT3 engine and an F1 engine was considerably different. But the whole Honda engine, I mean, look at where Honda are now, right? I mean, they're, could we say back then it was the engine or was it the car? I think it became very, very obvious in the first season of Renault in 2018 or 2017 when we moved to Renault and the car was still not so great. I think that change was needed for internal politics at McLaren to understand that actually it wasn't the engine. The engine was not perfect. Do not get me wrong. We had a lot of issues with the Honda engine. On the way to the grid, the engine going wrong and things like that, which was quite demoralising. But you have to remember that Honda were entering back into Formula One as an engine manufacturer, and building an engine is not an easy task. Designing and building an engine is not an easy task. So I think that transition to Renault was needed, probably for Honda and for McLaren. But yeah, I think it highlighted a few things within the McLaren car itself and the architecture.
So you said you started off as building test mechanic, then you move on to be a race team mechanic, and you're number 2 mechanic for Alonso. Sort of, first of all, can you explain again sort of what a number 2 mechanic is, what their job is? Because obviously we've heard the various. I mean, there's lots of mechanics, but they all have different jobs. So if you could explain a little bit what particularly a number 2 mechanic does.
Yeah, so obviously there's 2 cars per team. Each car has a car crew of mechanics. You have 1 number 1 mechanic and 4 number 2 mechanics. There's only 5 mechanics per car. The number 1 mechanic is responsible for overseeing the whole car. They'll go off and do the build specification meetings with the race engineers and whatever. If we're running at Mexico, we'll have a different build schedule to if we're running at somewhere like Monaco, let's say, because there's a lot of differences in the track. So they'll go off and do all that. And then the 4 number 2 mechanics, their primary roles are to build that car to the correct specification and obviously to the reliability as well, so we're not having failures and things. So that's your core role as a number 2 mechanic. And as a team of McLaren, you have the 5 guys or girls on Fernando's car, for instance. Then you have the 5 guys or girls on Stoffel's car when I was there. And then those 10 people make up part of the pit stop crew. Obviously, the pit stop crew is 18 people. So the other 8 people that make up the pit stop crew come from the support guys who work at the back of the garage, who build the rear wings and build the suspension and fit out all the brakes and stuff like that. So as a group, we all come together to service both cars at a pit stop. But what doesn't happen often at all, is if there's crash damage and it's a real big fight to get a car back onto the grid or onto the during FP1 or something. Sometimes both car crews come together, but actually the more people you throw at a situation like that, the more counterproductive it can be.
Yeah, too many chefs.
Yeah, exactly. But you're so well rehearsed in the area of the car you work that you could pretty much build it blindfolded. It's that kind. You build these cars 3 or 4 times in a weekend completely, not just putting parts in. You build it and strip it 3 or 4 times in a weekend. So you become very well rehearsed on your area of the car.
And what particular area was your area out of interest?
So I worked on the rear of the car. So you have one guy who's called a front ender who works on the front. So he'll work on basically the bulkhead, cockpit, front suspension, all the way up to the front end of the nose. Then you'll have one guy who will work on the chassis. So he'll do the engine install, he'll do all the pipe work, all the radiators, all the oil lines, everything like that, all the hydraulics. Then you have two guys who work on the rear of the car. So they'll do gearbox build, they'll do rear suspension, they'll do rear wing installs, they'll do everything like that. They'll help assist quite a lot with the engine installed as well. So, but it's all well and good knowing your area of the car, but if there's a crash at the front and the driver's knocked one of the front corners off, everyone is expected to get involved. So not only do you have to know your area well, you have to know the whole car. So it really does come down to teamwork and trust.
And is there any rivalry between the two groups? I mean, obviously not to a mad extent, or is there any like friendly competition between you and sort of, as you say, Stoffel Van Dorn's group?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think a bit of friendly competition never hurt anyone. But at the end of the day, you're a team, and that's drilled into you from winter testing. Winter testing, you're only running one car a lot of the time, so you are sharing that car. But yeah, there's lots of areas of competition. Pit stops is a particular area of competition, per corner or whatever. But yeah, ultimately, if something goes wrong, you're all there to get stuck in because you're working for that constructor's title or whatever.
So let's talk a little bit about the driver that obviously you were on that team. How was Fernando? Like, what was he like? What was he? I mean, he's a legend in the sport, isn't he? And he's still racing today. So sort of what was it to be working every day with him, and sort of what is he like away from the cameras?
Yeah, I mean, well, he is. You're right. He is a legend of the sport, isn't he? Fernando's great. He I think he talks his mind, which is good because Fernando is probably one of the rare drivers that can set a car up. He comes back and he tells the performance engineer, this is what we need to do, not to the exact kind of millimeter of adjustment, but he is very, very, very good at feedback. Whereas a lot of the younger drivers, they tell the race engineer a bit more about how they feel the car, and the race engineer then has to decipher that. But as a guy, it's tough. We don't really have much to do with the drivers outside of, apart from them driving the car. But they have to trust that we have built them a car that they can go 300 odd kilometers an hour in, and it's going to be reliable. So there is a lot of trust there. And drivers do so they do take you for dinner as a group and things like that at particular races of the season. But the drivers have crazy lives, right? They get in the car, they race the car around the track, they then get out, they feed back to the engineers, they do all of that, then they go and do their PR pieces. It is, and then at the end of the day they disappear off whilst we're building the car. But that's what it is. They have their areas that they're busy, we have our areas where we're busy, and there's not too much crossover outside of the car, which I guess is probably quite normal for all teams, I'd say.
And how much sort of time is he spending at the factory in a typical week for a driver? Is it one day a week maybe, or even less than that?
Yeah, during the season it's not much at all. There's if there's a big gap between races and things like that, they'll head back, and same for the mechanics. But if it's, I mean, you see the calendar these days, it's double headers, triple headers, and that's tough on everyone. So just as important as it is people being back in the factory, it's just as important as having a bit of time off to, be at your optimum performance for the next race or the next potentially 3 races back to back.
And so obviously Fernando retires eventually. Were you still there for that more, or had you gone as well? I think Carlos Sainz took his seat. Did you have any interaction with Carlos?
Yeah, so Carlos was the other side of the gap. So I left the same year as Fernando left. So end of 2018, he left McLaren. But yeah, so yeah, Carlos was great. I think Carlos has a lot of potential, and obviously the news has just come out about Lewis and Ferrari. So I would really, really hope that Carlos gets a seat 2025. So we will see. I could see him in green and black at Mercedes, but
So thinking about your time at McLaren, is there any fun stories that stick out? Because like you said, it's a mad job. You're going around the world. You were essentially with your group of mates, like you've all worked together so long. Is there any particular stories that stick out for you from your time there?
Oh yeah, a lot probably. I mean, like you're right. You're a family. You end up traveling. You do 60 odd flights a year. You're away for however many hundreds of days of the year, out of the
Mhm.
country. It's tough. And if you're having a bad season, back in the holidays, if you're having a bad season, all you tend to see is the hotel, the circuit, the airport, and that can happen back to back every weekend. But
Mhm.
I think more so now than ever, the team managers and team principals are realizing that it is really important to have downtime. So they're kind of bringing in a bit more of a crew change and rotation and things like that, which is good. But don't get me wrong, we had opportunities in lots of countries to go and explore and things, even if it's for a day or a couple of days. But one memory that sticks in my mind with McLaren was that we were in Monaco, and Monaco, as you know, it's a nightmare of a track. Everyone
Mhm.
loves it because it's Monaco. It is a nightmare trying to take 40 tons of kit down the streets of Monaco, building them
Mhm.
up in this garage where you've got quite literally a tree growing through the middle of your garage, and they've built your garage around it, and it's chaos.
Mhm.
But one particular year we were there, and the traffic was crazy and things like that. And it was the day we were flying home actually, and we were all still outside, and the bus never turned up because the bus got caught in a tunnel and there was a fire or something like that. It was chaos. But the team manager realised how important it was to get everyone home because we'd just been away on a triple header. So he ordered a bunch of taxis for the guy, well, for the group. Obviously, there wasn't enough seats. So he was like, right, who wants to go in the taxis and go to the airport? And obviously, a lot of people were like, yeah, I want to go. Like, jumping in the taxi, I'm going home. And a few of us, there's probably 9 or 10 of us, were kind of like, well, it's fine. Let them go if they want to go. We'll stay in Monaco an extra night. Whatever. We'll just go home tomorrow. And he was like, right, okay, so you guys who are going in the taxis, you go sit in your taxis. You guys, you go over there. And it was a
Mhm.
very clear divide. And then he turned around and said, right, the guys who didn't want to go in the taxis, you guys, if you make your way to the helipad, there's 3 helicopters waiting, and they're going to fly you from Monaco over to the airport. And
Oh
obviously,
wow.
everyone in the taxi was kind of like, "Oh, that's not fair." Blah blah blah. And the team manager was like, "You picked it. You wanted to
Mhm.
go home."
Very cool.
So you can imagine we got to the airport and we were in the lounge drinking a beer before they even got through check-in.
Oh, perfect. Absolutely. What a
I
way to
mean,
leave Monaco.
things like that are quite rare, but
Mhm.
that's the extent that teams do go to because they appreciate how important that R&R is after a
Mhm.
tough race weekend.
Yeah, and you mentioned that obviously we're about to go into a season with 24 races. Like, do you think that number's too much, or would you say that it's just not fair on the staff, really?
It's not. It is a lot. I mean, I think Formula One want to increase the race number because it's a sport. It's great for the fans. It's great for countries to host Formula One races. But I do think there has to be a little bit more thought behind the logistics of the staffing. Most importantly, the staffing because they are the ones that are putting the time in building the cars. But also logistically, it's getting quite tough for teams because there's all these budgets coming in, and you
Mhm.
can only have a certain amount of components, and that means you might have to fly a bit more air freight around, which means it's a little bit more expensive because you can't make more quantities of certain parts to put in sea freight to ship around. So I think it is becoming a little bit too much. I think the kind
Mhm.
of 20-21 races a year was quite nice. Um, but I do know that the crew changes are there's this crew rotation where you have a couple races off a year and things like that, which undoubtedly helps the staff who are
Mhm.
away all year.
You mentioned Monaco being one of the harder tracks. Was there a particular track that you always loved going to? You always look forward to on the calendar?
I personally loved Singapore.
Mhm.
It's a great country. It's an amazing place. But it was just it felt like you got a lot of time off because the way they structure the P1, Friday practice 1, Friday practice 2, and quali and stuff, they got pushed back a bit because it was a night race.
Mhm.
So they all get pushed back a little bit. So you end up having quite a lot of time off in Singapore, which means you can go and explore or you can do your own thing and whatnot. But also, the circuit's great. It's a great race. It's a great country. Yeah, so Singapore. I have a soft spot for Singapore. I'm hopefully going to try
Yeah.
and get back there this year because my birthday's around Singapore, so I'm
Oh,
hoping to
fantastic.
get back there for it this year. Yeah, that'd be
How about
nice.
the heat? I mean, obviously it's hot for the drivers. What's it like for the mechanics?
Oh, it's just as tough. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, drivers. Yeah, they don't get me wrong. They sit in the car. They're surrounded by everything that's hot, everything that's heat soaked from racing. But the mechanics equally spend just as long in race suits, albeit sat down waiting for a pit stop to happen. But we've been doing it for probably 3 days leading up to the race, and then after the race. What people don't realize is that as a race mechanic, you're not just there for the cars, but you're there for the garage build. You have to build the garages. You then go on to build the cars, and then after the race is finished. You've just done an 8-hour day, and then you've got 40 tons of equipment to pack up and a car to strip down and send off, and that's another 8-hour day on top. So on a Sunday, you don't typically end up finishing until early hours in the morning because you've got so much stuff to do.
I haven't been to the race. I always find it fascinating. Like, you can have this race on Sunday, all the fans cheering, all the podium, all the stuff like that. But an hour later, you'll go down the pit lane, and there will be like lorry after lorry after lorry, and just people stuffing onto another one. So it is a mad operation how this whole massive circus really like gets transported from Mexico to Brazil and then back to Vegas or whatever. So it's always a fascinating sight about an hour after a race is over.
The travelling circus, as everyone calls it. But it is literally the second that checkered flag goes down, that's it. You're in kind of, you service the car, you strip the car, engine goes off to whoever the engine manufacturer is, the gearbox and chassis and stuff will all get serviced there and then, or decided it's going back to the factory to be worked on. But, pit gantries come down, pit wall boxes come down, all the garage operations inside come down. It is a mammoth task. There's forklifts driving around everywhere, and you're quite often working until 2-3 o'clock in the morning. And typically, you'll go back to the hotel, get a shower. You might have, if you're lucky, a couple hours sleep, and then you're on the plane. And you might be flying to, like you just said, you might be flying to Vegas, or you might be flying to wherever next. So it can be brutal. Yeah, it really can. Certainly if you've got Friday and Saturday and you have no sleep.
And even on the non-weeks off, I mean, I've always heard that you're pretty much back in the office 9 o'clock Monday morning, aren't you? Like, it's even then, there's not much of a break.
Yeah, it can be. I think it's got a lot better. I mean, when it was international races, we would tend to, if there wasn't a race in the week, you'd fly home and you'd be home, you'd be off work. But if it's European, you would, because you'd go out to a European race on the Tuesday or the Wednesday. A couple of days later, you tend to get back and then go into the factory. But the internationals, you basically travel Monday to Monday. So any time off in between, they make sure you're off at home. Hence, then full circle where the car build team come in, because they're the ones that then service the equipment whilst you're off. So,
So we mentioned you left the same year as Fernando. Do you want to tell me why you left and sort of what you went on to do?
Yeah, so I loved Formula One. I really enjoyed it. It was everything I wanted and more. However, one thing I struggled with in Formula One was that there's not much. It sounds crazy because it's a very innovative sport, but there's not much problem solving and diagnostics. You are, as a mechanic, don't get me wrong, you're working at the pinnacle of motorsport, but you are changing components. If something goes wrong, you change that component. So, albeit you're working in this fast-paced, high-pressure environment, it very much is a role for someone who, just doesn't mind that kind of fitting. My brain works a little bit differently. I like to be diagnosing. I like to be, okay, well, this is broken. Let's innovate. Let's do this. But that's, there's a whole design team for that back at the factory. So maybe I was a little bit naive going into it as to actually, the roles and responsibilities. But go back to GT racing, and it is very much something breaks. You haven't got the budget to be just changing parts out. You innovate. If an engine goes wrong, you might not have a full complete engine to stick in. So actually you have to take an engine apart and, change a cylinder head or change an oil pump or whatever. Whereas with Formula One, it was very much, replace and carry on. But I also always wanted to have my own business, be a boss of my own. I've always been very, very passionate about that. So that was the reason why I left McLaren. I wouldn't change where I am now for the world, because I really enjoy what I do now. But also I loved the opportunity I had to say that I've worked in Formula One.
I mean, you mentioned what you do now. I mean, that's equally interesting. If you want to tell the audience sort of what it is you do now and what keeps you busy these days.
Yeah, sure. So very much still involved in engineering and automotive, the automotive world. We've got a couple businesses based down here in the southwest. One of them is an off-highway electric vehicle manufacturer, which we've basically built from the ground up. So that's quite exciting. We're just about to sign a manufacturing deal in Australia for a mining company. So it's a 6x6 electric hydrogen vehicle. But I also do a lot of contracting work. So I'm actually heading out to Abu Dhabi next Saturday to work on the A2RL autonomous project. I'm not sure if you've heard of that.
Yeah, I've heard of bits and pieces. Yeah, but it'd be good
Yeah,
to
okay.
hear.
So that's quite an interesting project. That's a single-seater race car, and they are effectively removing the driver and fitting it with a computer stack, which has got radar, lidar, GPS. And at the end of April at Yas Marina, there is a full race week of 10 autonomous racing cars, which is a little bit scary. But innovation, it's really, really exciting. So yeah, so I do a mixture of things in amongst my own businesses and things. I still like to get involved in motorsport.
And do you still watch F1? Just keep an eye out, or is it once you finish, you sort of, I'm done with that, I never want to see it again, kind of thing?
No, I do watch it, and I love it because at the end of the race, I turn the TV off, and that's me done. And I know what we've got to do, unfortunately. But no, I'm still very much in touch with. I made some friends for life at McLaren. Still speak to them very regularly. Still meet up with them quite often when they're not out traveling this, as a traveling circus. But yeah, I very much watch it. I really enjoy watching it. I like to see the innovation still, and I equally like to hear people's thoughts on where it's going in the future, because I think Formula One's at a very interesting time.
Where do you think it's going in the future? Because obviously you mentioned about autonomous driving and stuff like that. I mean, there's loads of places F1 could go. What do you think it would do eventually?
There is, yeah. I think there's this huge push on sustainability. I think it's a good thing. I do think that they will stay as internal combustion engines. I think synthetic fuels, albeit it's very expensive at the moment to run on, and development costs expensive. But I think as everything scale of economy, that price will come down, and I think Formula One will always be combustion engine. But I don't think it will go autonomous. I think autonomous has its applications, but I think having a driver in Formula One is what makes it interesting, because it's human input. If you put an AI in a car, like we're going to find out in Yas Marina in a few months' time, I think the racing will be not as fierce as if it's got a human making that decision.
And finish this off, obviously we're a few weeks out for pre-season testing. I mean, looking at McLaren, it seems like it looks like it's shaped to be a great year for them after last year. Sort of, how do you see them doing this year coming up?
I mean, look at what they did last year. It was it's probably one of their best seasons they've had for such a long time in terms of how they turn it around. It was really impressive. I will always be McLaren through and through. So I do really hope they have a really good season. I think the grid, and as we spoke earlier about the kind of iterative changes through a new car design over the years, I think the grid gets closer and closer and closer. So last year it was pretty close. I think this year it will be just as close, if not. I think teams have had a lot of time to look at Red Bull's last year car, and we will see a lot of cars this year looking like last year's Red Bull. I personally believe. I mean, why would you design and develop something that's not proven, right? It's
yeah, exactly.
So I think it'll be a really interesting year. I really do.
Do you think McLaren can win a race? Put you on the spot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. They have the drivers. 100%, they have the drivers, and I think last year they were very, very close with the car. So I think a little bit more improvement on the development of the car, and I think they will run. They have it in them for sure.
Perfect. Well, that's been an absolutely fascinating chat, Josh. Thanks again for joining us. I'm sure the audience will love hearing it as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sam. Really appreciate it.
My thanks goes out to Josh for what I'm sure you will agree was a fascinating episode of just what it was like to work at McLaren. My thanks also goes to you for listening, and with the F1 2024 season rapidly approaching, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a release here on the Pondering Papaya podcast.